The committee will come to order. Today we will hear from Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan and General Joseph Dunford, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and David Norquist, performing the duties of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Secretary Shanahan, although you are not a stranger to the subcommittee, this will be your first time testifying before us, so do welcome you. Welcome Deputy Secretary Norquist as well. Good to see you back in an appropriations room. General Dunford, I do believe that you have testified before the subcommittee annually since 2013 in 3 different roles, which must be some sort of record. I realize this will be your final time before us, and I would want to take this opportunity from the bottom of my heart, I think for all of us, just to thank you for just being a stellar human being and for your service to this country. You've just been terrific to deal with. Gentlemen, in your written testimonies and previous briefings for the fiscal year 2020 budget request, it is clear the department is going to great lengths to tie most decisions to the priorities laid out in the National Defense Strategy. While I disagree with several aspects of the NDS, I do think the document provides an accurate assessment of the strategic environment and generally points the department in the right direction. However, as with many ambitious plans, the question is, how are we going to pay for it? For the next 2 fiscal years, it is impossible to answer that question without discussing the Budget Control Act, also known as the BCA. The initial impact of the BCA caps was admittedly severe. However, the Department of Defense has received a total of $264 billion in base budget relief from the caps since 2012. Most of that occurred in fiscal years 17 through 19, when the department's budget increased by 13% in nominal terms. The fiscal year 20 budget request proposes another increase of 4.9%, or $33 billion. Further, there are about $11 billion in unfunded requirements and priorities requested by the services and combatant commands for fiscal year 2020. Even the fiscal year 20 budget request recognizes that the funding increases of this magnitude are unsustainable and slows the rate of growth across future years. In the out years, the department claims that it will be able to prioritize modernization by relying on savings, reforms, and efficiencies that have been notoriously difficult to achieve in the past. I do wish the administration can muster the same courage to attack the BCA caps with the same relish it is using to implement the National Defense Strategy. Rather, the department's budget request eschews the caps by using the overseas contingency operation accounts, which are exempt from the caps, to fund base activities. In both fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21, the budget requests nearly $100 billion in OCO to base to support the National Defense Strategy. These OCO for base funds are in addition to traditional OCO, which is projected to exceed $60 billion in each of those years. Admittedly, OCO for base is not a new concept, but the amounts requested in the budget are staggeringly out of proportion with prior efforts to avoid the caps. However, in fiscal year 22, after the BCA caps sunset, OCO for base disappears, and traditional OCO miraculously shrinks to $20 billion. People's cynicism about this approach can be understood. I must also say that as a member of the legislative branch, I am grossly offended by the unconstitutional actions taken by the executive branch to fund the construction of an unauthorized wall on our southern border, using funds that Congress declined to appropriate for that purpose, and over the denial of this committee and others, the Department of Defense is in the process of conveying billions to the Department of Homeland Security. There is no emergency at the border that requires the use of the United States Armed Forces. We are here to appropriate funds needed for the military, not to make good on a campaign promise. It is in that same vein, last night, that Congress was notified that OMB will be submitting a $377 million supplemental request for border security. A portion of that will be in support of military personnel deployed at the border. There will likely be questions on the cost and value of the troops deployed to the border. So I'm going to ignore that for the time being. But I cannot ignore the fact that Congress is still waiting for OMB and the Department of Defense to send over a comprehensive supplemental request to address the extensive damage to key military installations for national disasters. Just yesterday, the Commandant of the Marine Corps said one of his biggest challenges is getting assistance to rebuild Camp Lejeune. We heard similar comments from the Air Force leadership earlier this year about Tyndall Air Force Base. And I am baffled by the administration's decision not to prioritize the rebuilding of these very important installations. With that, I do thank you for appearing before the committee today. We will ask you to present your summarized testimony in a moment, but first I would want to recognize my colleague, Mr. Calvert, for any opening remarks he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, General Dunford, Mr. Norquist, welcome. We appreciate your appearance before the subcommittee. And General, also, I want to congratulate you on a job well done. I know you're probably happy about this being your last time to come before Congress, but we certainly appreciate having you here. And I know that you have done fantastic service to this country, and we all appreciate it very much. As you prepare to depart, General, we certainly want to get your assessment of readiness, given your vantage point of seeing across the services for many years. The budget submitted by the department dovetails with the National Defense Strategy, which calls for more of a focus on near-peer threats. However, the recent bombings in Sri Lanka show that there's still violent extremist groups willing to conduct suicide bombs to achieve their goals. It doesn't cost a lot of money to plan, coordinate, and carry out these attacks. It can kill hundreds of innocent citizens in minutes. The Taliban has also announced its spring offensive. They killed 4 of our troops in Afghanistan just a few weeks ago. And despite nearly 2 decades of fighting, we clearly still face threats emanating from that region. While we have rightly been focused on the Middle East, our adversaries surged. We now need to redouble our efforts to ensure that the U.S. remains a beacon of strength around the world and can remain competitive across a spectrum of threats. We must build and enhance our technical superiority, strengthen our cyber capabilities, provide the best training and equipment for our men and women in uniform. I look forward to working with Chairman Visclosky and the rest of the members of the subcommittee to ensure the department has the resources it needs. I do want to point out to my good friend, the chairman, that the wall is authorized. We did the Secure Fence Act in 2006, and we partially appropriated funds for about 700 miles along the southern border. Our good friend Jerry Lewis was involved in that at that time, along with Chairman Rogers. But I know that's one of our more ticklish subjects to talk about, and we may have disagreements on, but we do have a problem along the southern border, and I hope we can address it in a meaningful way. But I'm sure we'll be having those discussions today, and I certainly thank our witnesses. Thank you all for your service to our country, and looking forward to hearing from you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The full committee chair, Ms. Lowy, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a pleasure for me to welcome Acting Secretary Shanahan, General Dunford, and I too join our colleague in wishing you the very, very best. It's been an honor for me to interact with you, to learn from you, to work with you, and our very best wishes. And of course, Acting Deputy Secretary Norquist, thank you all for your service. In the last 2 years, the world has become more dangerous, with adversaries seeking to harm the United States and our interests around the world. The Department of Defense's ability to address an evolving threat landscape is of paramount importance, and the security of our nation, as well as our allies, depends on your service. While I am pleased your budget focuses on readiness and further strengthening our military, I'm concerned by the short-sightedness of shifting nearly $100 billion into OCO accounts. I know it's been said before, but maybe it has to be said again, so I will proceed. Your fiscal year 2020 budget for this subcommittee requests $697.263 billion, which includes a staggering $163.98 billion for OCO. The OCO request is further divided into two categories: OCO at $66.7 billion, and OCO for base activities at $97.9 billion. Of the $97.9 billion for OCO for base, $85.2 billion is requested for the operation and maintenance account, which funds readiness for all of DoD. We owe it to our service members and their families to put forth serious spending proposals. The idea of using OCO spending for base requirements is a thinly veiled attempt to skirt budget caps and increase defense spending without a complementary increase for non-defense spending. Moreover, requesting OCO funds for base is fiscally irresponsible, as costs to increase end strength dovetail in future spending bills as service members receive raises and eventual pensions. Our service members deserve the stability and to know they will be taken care of in the future, and the administration's proposal makes that look less likely. Our national security apparatus does not exist in a vacuum. It relies on the health and stability of Americans and our economy, and this requires adequate budgeting and investments in both defense and non-defense priorities. So I thank you for your service, and I look forward to your testimony.
I now recognize our former chair and the ranking member on the full committee, Ms. Granger.
Thank you, Chairman Vislavsky. I'd like to welcome today's witnesses, Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan, General Dunford, and Mr. Norquist. Thank you for appearing before this subcommittee. I first would like to recognize General Dunford, who served with distinction as the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff since 2015, and you'll step down from this position in September. General Dunford, thank you for all that you've done, your many years of service, and we look forward to hearing your assessment of the military readiness today. Thank you for being here. For almost 2 decades, our military is focused on the threat of terrorism, and counterinsurgency efforts have dominated our military planning. We're now at a very important crossroads. The National Defense Strategy emphasizes a shift to deter and, if necessary, defeat more traditional adversaries such as Russia and China. Unfortunately, the recent Easter Sunday attacks in Sri Lanka showed we have to remain vigilant against violent extremists around the world. To guard against all of these threats, we have to work together to build on the gains we've made with our allies and our partners, develop more advanced weapon systems, and recruit and retain highly trained personnel. The Department of Defense is also being asked to play a supporting role at the southern border, where law enforcement agents and officers are beyond overwhelmed. I've been to the border many times, and I can tell you this is indeed a crisis. We thank our soldiers and our military personnel for the work they're doing to keep our country's border secure, and we're going to have to do more. I know members of this committee agree that supporting our national defense is one of the most important roles we take on as members of Congress. We've accomplished so much over the last 2 years, but we have work to do. We must avoid unnecessary delays in enacting next year's funding for the Department of Defense, and we need a budget agreement that prevents sequestration. Otherwise, the gains we've made together to rebuild our military will be reversed. Chairman Veslosky, thank you again for holding this important hearing. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses, and I thank them for their tireless service to our country, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, you can proceed, and then General Dunford would ask, for the sake of time, so members have a chance for a dialogue. If you could hold your summaries to about 5 minutes or so, that would be preferred. Thank you very much.
Chairman Veslosky, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2020. I'm joined by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, and the Department's Comptroller and Chief Financial Officer, Mr. David Norquist. It has been a great privilege and honor to serve alongside the men and women of the Department of Defense. And it was a pleasure to work with Secretary Mattis to craft the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Released in January 2018, that strategy laid the foundation for restoring military readiness and modernizing our joint force for an era of great power competition. I now oversee the continued execution of that strategy, which is the undisputed driver of today's budget request. It was extremely helpful for the Department to receive authorization and appropriation bills on time at the requested top line last year, which marked the first time in a decade a defense appropriations has been enacted by the beginning of the fiscal year. The strategy you supported last year is the same strategy we are asking you to fund this year. The $750 billion top line for the national defense enables DoD to maintain irregular warfare as a core competency, yet prioritizes modernization and readiness to compete, deter, and win in a high-end fight of the future. This budget is critical for the continued execution of our strategy, and it reflects difficult but necessary decisions that align finite resources with our strategic priorities. To highlight some of those decisions, this is the largest research, development, testing, and evaluation budget in 70 years. The budget includes double-digit increases to our investments in both space and cyber, modernization of our nuclear triad and missile defense capabilities, and the largest shipbuilding request in 20 years when adjusted for inflation. It also increases our end strength by roughly 7,700 service members and provides 3.1% pay increase to our military, the largest in a decade. Now to the specifics. The top line slates $718 billion for the Department of Defense. Of that total, the budget includes $545 billion for base funding and $164 billion for overseas contingency operations. Of the OCO funds, $66 billion will go to direct war and enduring requirements, and $98 billion will fund base requirements. To round out the numbers, $9.2 billion will fund emergency construction, including support for hurricane recovery and border barrier efforts. Here I must note the Department appreciates this committee's support for hurricane recovery. Thank you for approving the $600 million reprogramming, which will help start our recovery efforts. I ask for your support for the hurricane supplemental to address the remaining $1.8 billion needed in FY19, as well as the budget request of $3 billion in military construction and operation and maintenance to continue recovery efforts in FY20. As this committee fully understands, no enemy in the field has done more damage to our military's combat readiness in years past than sequestration and budget instability. And there is no question today our adversaries are not relenting. In short, we cannot implement the NDS at sequestration levels. Sequestration would not only halt our progress in rebuilding readiness, growing our force, modernizing for the future, and investing in critical emerging capabilities like AI, hypersonics, and directed energy. It would force us to cut end strength and critical modernization efforts that ensure we outpace our competitors. A continuing resolution would also hamstring the department. Under a CR, we cannot start new initiatives, including increased investments in cyber, space, nuclear modernization, and missile defense I just mentioned. Second, our funding will be in the wrong accounts. And third, we would lose buying power. We built this budget to implement our national defense strategy, and I look forward to working with you to ensure predictable funding so our military can remain the most lethal, adaptable, and resilient fighting force in the world. I appreciate the critical role Congress plays to ensure our warfighters can succeed on the battlefields of today and tomorrow, and I thank our service members, their families, and all those in the Department of Defense for maintaining constant vigilance as they stand always ready to protect our freedoms. Thank you.
Secretary General.
Chairman Visklowski, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to join Secretary Shanahan and Secretary Norquist here today. It remains my privilege to represent your soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. While much of our discussion this morning is going to focus on the challenges we face, it's important I begin by assuring you that your armed forces can deter a nuclear attack, defend the homeland, meet our alliance commitments, and effectively respond should deterrence fail. I believe we have a competitive advantage over any potential adversary defined as the ability to project power and win at the time and place of our choosing. But as members of this committee know, 17 years of continuous combat and fiscal instability have affected our readiness and eroded our competitive advantage. As the Secretary highlighted, China and Russia have capitalized on our distraction and restraints by investing in capabilities specifically designed to challenge our traditional sources of strength. After careful study, they've developed capabilities intended to contest our freedom of movement across all domains and disrupt our ability to project power. With the help of Congress, starting in 2017, we began to restore our competitive advantage. Recent budgets have allowed us to build readiness and invest in new capabilities while meeting our current operational requirements. We can't reverse decades of erosion in just a few years, and this committee knows that as well as any. This year's budget submission will allow us to continue restoring our competitive advantage by improving readiness and developing capabilities to enhance our lethality. It proposes investments in advanced capabilities across all domains: sea, air, land, space, and cyberspace. This year's budget also sustains investments in our nuclear enterprise to ensure a safe, secure, and effective strategic deterrent, the highest priority of the department. We've also taken steps to more effectively employ the force we have and build the force we need tomorrow. We've implemented fundamental changes in our global force management process to prioritize and allocate resources in accordance with the Secretary's National Defense Strategy. We do all this while building readiness and the flexibility to respond to unforeseen contingencies. And because two members raised it early in their comments, I can assure you that as we have made these adjustments to our global force management posture, we're also addressing the sustained requirement against violent extremism. We've also redefined our process for developing and designing a future force that will enable us to pair emerging technologies with innovative operating concepts. In closing, I'd like to thank the committee for all you've done to support our men and women in uniform and their families. Together, we've honored our solemn obligation to never send our sons and daughters into a fair fight, and with your continued support, we never will.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get to my question, I just want to point out, I think everybody agrees here that we need to come to a budget agreement. Certainly our collective national defense is at risk if we don't do that and do it on time. But, you know, as you all know, we all know here, it takes three to tango in the budget process, not just the White House, but the Senate and the House. And so all of us need to get together as soon as possible and come up with a top-line number, not just for this budget year, but I would hope for the next budget year. And then we can try to separate this appropriations process from the political world out there, and that we can do the right thing and pass these bills on time. And I'm sure we can all agree that that would be a great goal to have. Since all of you are here today, I thought I'd ask a topical question about our own hemisphere and the resources we've obviously the Southern Command is not something we put a lot of resources in, but it's all of a sudden it seems to be more important with what's going on in Venezuela. Maybe you can give us a report on the latest in Venezuela as of this morning.
Thank you, Ranking Member Calvert. You know, we're obviously watching the situation very closely in Venezuela. The President's made it clear that all options are on the table. To date, most of our actions have been diplomatic and economic. We certainly were prepared to support the life and safety of civilians, American citizens, when they were there. They were safely withdrawn some weeks ago. Situation's a little bit unclear today from our perspective between Maduro and Guaido, Guaido being a legitimate member of the government. We're doing what we can now to collect intelligence, to make sure we have good visibility on what's happening down in Venezuela, and also be prepared to support the President should he require more from the U.S. military.
Thank you. General, in our hearings, we've been talking obviously a lot about Russia and China for obvious reasons. However, what happened in Sri Lanka last week, which killed 290 people and injured at least 500 who were at churches, hotels, shows that we can't let our guard down when it comes to violent extremists. To that extent, can you tell us in this setting more about the attack? How sophisticated was it, and how was it funded?
Ranking Member Calvert, we're still working with the Sri Lankans to get the exact details. I don't want to make news in front of the Sri Lankans in terms of what they know. My assessment was it was very sophisticated in terms of the simultaneity attack and the techniques that were used by the Sri Lankans. I think it exposes exactly what you talked about, which is the fight against ISIS is not over, and the underlying conditions that feed violent extremism still exist, and it highlights the need for us, even in the context of great power competition, to make sure that we have a politically, fiscally, and militarily sustainable approach to violent extremism, because some people have called it a generational problem, and I wouldn't take issue with that characterization of how long we'll be dealing with this.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
President Trump met with Kim Jong-un in June 2018 and February 2019 to discuss denuclearization and sanctions relief. However, intelligence suggests that North Korea has started rebuilding key missile test facilities, although there is no sign of an immediate launch. On April 25th, Kim Jong-un met with Vladimir Putin in hopes of securing Putin's support for the North Korean regime, sanctions relief, and a gradual, not quick, disarmament plan. Mr. Secretary, have there been any discussions or negotiations between the United States and North Korean officials since the latest summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un?
The denuclearization of North Korea remains the primary objective. Diplomacy is the primary track. What I can tell you militarily is we have not changed our position, our operations, or our strength, and are continuing to conduct readiness exercises in the event diplomacy fails.
To your knowledge, have the North Koreans resumed any nuclear enrichment activities or missile testing since the Vietnam summit?
I'm not aware of any.
And can you share with us any information you may have on the recent Kim-Putin summit? And were there any agreements made that will impact life on the peninsula?
You know, what I would share is that the sanctions that we continue to impose will stay in place, and we'll be vigilant on maintaining those sanctions.
And following up on that, could you describe the relationship between North and South Korea? Has anything changed after the latest summit did not achieve any agreements?
The relationship continues to evolve. There are ongoing activities in terms of coordination. Maybe I'd ask General Dunford to talk about some of the recent exercises that we've had between North Korea and South Korea and ourselves.
Chairwoman, in terms of North and South Korea, the basic question is, has the relationship changed? And I don't assess that it has. South Korea has not taken any material steps different than the previous agreements with North Korea. What the Secretary is alluding to is our exercises, and what I can assure you is working with the South Koreans, We're continuing to conduct exercises that maintain an appropriate level of readiness, not only for our forces on the peninsula, but for the Combined Forces Command, which is both South Korea and the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Granger?
Mr. Secretary, I don't ever recall being more outraged. Was terrible. I can't believe that these program managers think that it is acceptable to wait another 4 years for a program to be implemented when we spent billions of dollars and worked on it for over a decade. There seems to be no sense of urgency, and our service members and veterans are the ones who are suffering while they're waiting for the DOD and VA to get their act together. I recently heard a story from a Vietnam veteran about the problems he had with his medical records. He is dying today. He's dying, and they could never confirm or find his medical records for his treatment. I hope you realize how absolutely incensed and infuriated most of us are about this. We can't wait later, and I want to know how you make it a priority and how you get it done.
First of all, I apologize for any lack of performance or the inability of the people that testified before you to characterize the work of the department in this very vital area. I personally have spent quite a bit of time on the new DHA plan on how do we merge together our medical treatment facilities, how do we deploy the electronic health records. In particular, in the Northwest was the first deployment of the electronic health record, one at Madigan Army Hospital, Bremerton Naval Base, Whidbey Island, Naval Air Station, and then Fairchild Air Force Base. That rollout and implementation was successful. This past fall, there's been a considerable amount of learning that's occurred from that. The next implementation of the major implementation of this system, and this system is what's going to drive the benefits of the DHS, is scheduled for this coming September in California. I can give you the commitment that the corrective action and the lessons learned from the first implementation will be carried forward into that implementation in California. It's training, it's processes, not just the electronic health records. We recognize that we owe it to our service men and women to take care of them. I mean, you have that commitment from me. This implementation is vital to getting the benefits of delivering higher level care. And the deputy and I will deliver on the commitment we have made to you and to our men and women.
I certainly hope so. We got a feeling of, well, we made a change of direction, and now it's going to take 4 more years, and that seemed to be fine with everyone on the panel. It was not fine with all of us.
Yeah. It's not fine here, and we'll come back and brief you to make sure that what they communicated was truly accurate, because we've been holding people's feet to the fire to get these MTFs integrated, but we owe you a better answer, and 4 years is unacceptable.
Thank you. On another issue, can I do another, still have some time? It has to do with the, we talked earlier about the space and the Space Force. I had a briefing recently that was astonishing to me, because I said, we don't really know enough of what we're doing. The case was made that it's a very, very important program. But I think it would be very helpful for us to have more information about it and the way forward so we can be supportive. I would hate to lose a program like that just because we don't really understand what's going on.
We're thinking about organizing a space day up here on the Hill so we can brief members and their staff in a, I'll say, less DOD-like vernacular, and really being succinct and clear on what the benefits and the resources required to implement the space agenda.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady, and before I recognize Ms. McCollum, I would simply associate myself and my concerns with her question about medical records, but I think I speak for everyone. Ms. Lowy, Mr. Rogers, Ms. Granger have been particularly active. And for some of us who have been on the committee for a period of time, we have basically had the same conversation with different iterations for 17 years. And we are concerned that people move this ahead. Ms. McCollum?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Dunford, I wish you all the best in your next mission, which will be retirement of some form, so all the best. Mr. Shanahan, thank you for the opportunity to visit with you and share some of the issues that concern both of us in the Department of Defense, which covers many, many aspects. But I'm going to focus on what I consider what I like to bring to the table, and that is focusing on the health of our servicemen and women, as well as making sure that they have the equipment and protection to complete their mission and come back home to their families. So one of the areas in which I kind of feel like I have a little bit of dual capacity is climate change and dealing with public health issues of air and water. When it comes to climate change, we had a discussion about what is going on. We're an Arctic nation. We need to pay more attention to the fact that we're an Arctic nation, and I look forward to working with you and the chair for this committee to receive more briefings on how we can prepare our posture for up there, work with our allies on the issue, and also address some of the infrastructure needs that we're going to have and equipment in there. The other issue that we had an opportunity to talk about is, in environmental issues. So I'm going to ask you not only ahead to work with the chair, as you had said that you were planning on doing on briefings on the Arctic, but also to prepare for us as a committee the effects of climate change. It's a national security issue in other countries. We get that. The reports are out there, but it's also a national security issue from what it's going to cost taxpayers to build resiliency into our infrastructure here or infrastructure that we're going to have to move. And we're going to have to start, I think, really addressing that and holding that out in the budgets. With what's going on, as the chair pointed out, it wasn't a foreign entity that caused the damage that Hurricane Michael and Florence did last year, and we're still struggling with getting those bases up and running. So I would look forward to working with you on those issues. I am going to ask you that we had this discussion a little bit to allow you to clarify something on the record with what's going on with the EPA, what's going on with the Department of Defense, and some chemicals that are referred to as PFAS. And I hold up, and we talked about in the office, a New York Times article, and I quote from it. After pressure from the Defense Department, the Environmental Protection Agency significantly weakened a proposed standard for cleaning up groundwater pollution caused by toxic chemicals and contaminated drinking water consumed by millions of Americans that have been commonly used also at military bases. So you had an explanation for what the Department of Defense is working on. So I'd like you to, on the record, tell us what the Department of Defense is doing, what you see as an appropriate cleanup level, whether or not the Pentagon, in fact, is pushing for weaker standards, and what is your commitment to the health and well-being of the servicemen and women that get up and go to work every single day. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. And the health and well-being of our service members is, besides national security, our number one priority. Just maybe to kind of keep all the items on the record. No one's drinking contaminated water at the over 400 sites in question. In terms of the use of these chemicals, we no longer train with them. We no longer test with them. The only use of them is in the event of a fire. The real work here is on remediation, which is, I think, the line of questioning. And what is played out in the media is the DOD advocating for a lesser standard than the EPA. And what I would say is we've agreed with the EPA on a common standard, and it was their standard. I think if we pulled apart where the discussions were occurring, it was on the processes to be used to implement the EPA standard. And we've been working to a set of Superfund processes where we are right now in the harmonization of using the EPA standards out for public comment, but I think in working with you and others, do we have the right standards, really now the question before us.
Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the question that you put before us. Do we have the right standards? We'll continue to work on that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, welcome. General Dunford, congratulations on a brilliant career. We wish you the best in the next chapter. It's been 10 years, at least, since we've heard the same assurances before this subcommittee and other committees of Congress about the medical health records. It's incredible that we can't get this fixed. In the meantime, we've got young veterans dying, going blind, suffering interminable illness because of bureaucratic crap. Each agency, veterans and DOD, have had their own systems, refusing to build a link between the two in order to give VA the medical information that it needs to help a veteran wounded during the fighting. My colleagues have heard me tell this story 1,000 times. Young man from my district who was injured in Iraq from a bomb. One eye was destroyed, the other severely damaged. They brought him to Germany and operated to try to save this one eye successfully. Not fully, but fairly well. Well, this eye then, as he becomes a veteran, becomes infected. So he goes to the Lexington VA hospital. They can't get access to his records from Germany. There's no way to get it. They knew he had been operated on, but they could not operate because they didn't know what had been done before, and they were afraid they would kill him. So he turned him away, and of course he went blind. That's inexcusable. And Mr. Secretary, I've heard your predecessors say, hey, we got it on the way, it's going to be here, the fix is in. Well, that's been 10 years, and we've poured billions of dollars into this seemingly simple problem. Why can't we have the computers marry? Can you help me out here? Don't promise something you can't deliver, but deliver.
I'm not going to promise you something I can't deliver, but I can maybe explain in part the difference between why these two computers can't talk to one another. There's a degree of interoperability that has to do with information like what's General Dunford's date of birth, or where is his home address. The real issue has been on the passing of the actual records. I don't know, I can't explain to you the technical complexity of that, but that's been the crux of the problem. I owe it to you and this committee to deliver on capability. I promise, to do my best. I'd love to be able to sit here today and say, let's draw a line in the sand. I can deliver this capability. We delivered on the first instantiation there in the Northwest.
We've had your staff people before this subcommittee on this question numerous times. It's been a constant barrage of questions from members of this subcommittee to you and your predecessors and your staffs. So you've known how strongly we all feel about this, and yet we're told it's going to take another 4 or 5 years. In the meantime, we're going to lose a lot of young soldiers who sacrificed their health in the defense of this country. I can't believe that we have not already solved this problem. General Dunford, do you have any thoughts about this?
Congressman, the last time I touched it was in a previous assignment, so I don't have anything to update you on. In my current assignment, I don't touch the specific issue every day, so I don't have any details on where we are.
Well, we sit here waiting. And, Mr. Secretary, we're going to hold your feet to the fire on this. Get it done. It's time. It's past time. And you've heard the chairman of this subcommittee and his strong feelings about this subject as well, much more important than mine. But we're going to stay with this again. And it's not going to take another 10 years or another 4 years. Get it done now. Stop the suffering. Thank you.
Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to each of you for being with us and for your service. I used to work in economic development in Tacoma, Washington. We had a sign in my office that said, "We are competing with everyone, everywhere, every day, forever," which I always found somewhat intimidating, but was a pretty good ethic, not just for folks who work in economic development. It's a pretty good ethic when we look at our national security challenges as well. I know part of the strategy is to focus on some of our near-peer competitors, the great power competition with Russia and China, and was hoping you could speak to that issue. Obviously, Russia and China have been modernizing while we have dealt with CRs and sequestration, which I think has certainly hindered your ability to engage to the level we need to. You've made clear that your top priorities are modernizing our armed forces to face these future threats. I was hoping you'd just take a minute or two, because I want to touch on another subject as well, and talk about how your budget reflects that focus and where your top priorities are in terms of our capacity to stay ahead of Russia and China.
Well, let me just follow on with the electronic health record here in setting up this comment. The priority in the budget is China and Russia in terms of the capability we have to address. We don't have a lower priority, and sir, we're going to fix the electronic health record. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, but you have our commitment, and I'm sure you've been told this many times, but we're spinning a lot of plates, but we won't drop the ball on our veterans and service members. But in terms of the prioritizations and where our investments, much of it is in modernization. We haven't modernized in 30 years. And there are, if we went to the Army, you'd see 6 different programs, but I would just say that at a top level, the emphasis is on space, cyber, and new missiles like hypersonics. And what you'd find in the budget, even though we've built it up with OCO for base, the way we constructed the budget last year is the same way we constructed it this year. And we're continuing to put greater and greater investment into modernization. I spoke to the fact that this is the biggest research and development budget in 70 years. Cyber is a significant investment because of kind of all the threats that we face today. That's probably the fastest evolving one. It's also the one that is easiest for people to develop on their own.
The other issue, and this to some degree is germane to the concerns around healthcare. I think all of us are concerned about the rise of suicide among active duty service members over the last few years. Worry that community stability has somehow become frayed. I know that that's a priority for each of you at that table, and I'm hoping you can speak to some of the work that the department is doing on this front to address issues around suicide, to hopefully rebuild a sense of community and relationships that hold service members and their families together, and ensure that the department is there for those who are serving when they most need our support.
Congressman, I'll start and express the same concern that you did about the rise in suicides. This is an issue that in several assignments I've been decisively engaged in it and looked hard at it. Probably the most promising thing I have seen is the multidisciplinary approach to healthcare. You can see that here in Washington, D.C., in the National Capital Area at the National Intrepid Center of Excellence, and we have satellite National Intrepid Center of Excellence sites around at our military bases and installations. We don't have them everywhere, but we have them in those areas where there's the highest incident and highest need, particularly for those returning from deployment. As you know, one of the perplexing challenges is that there's no common trend in terms of suicides amongst our active duty population. We can clearly see a correlation between deployment history and veterans. There is not a similar correlation between deployment history and the active duty population. But I guess to answer your question succinctly, I think it's the comprehensive approach to mental health care that includes leadership, the chaplain, the medical professionals, all in one place, having a common visibility about a soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine, and make sure we're dealing with the whole individual and not a compartmentalized approach to their care.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. General Dunford, let me just join everybody here. We are all very much in your debt and very appreciative of the service you've rendered our country. I'm going to use this occasion, Mr. Secretary, to talk about something that you can't do much directly about, but maybe you can talk to a couple of people that can. And I'm going to take the same opportunity to talk to the chairman of the full committee and my boss, the ranking member of the full committee. And I was asked earlier by another member, what are your top 3 priorities in the defense budget? And I said to avoid a shutdown, to avoid sequester, and to avoid a CR. Didn't have anything to do with the programs. I just want to do that. And because the budget looks pretty good to me, broadly speaking. But to do that, we have to have the President of the United States talk to the Speaker of the House, talk to the minority and majority, or the minority leader in the House, and obviously the majority leader in the Senate, minority leader in the Senate, and get us a set of numbers. I mean, right now, we're going to mark up a bill at some point, and we're going to do it to notional numbers. They're not real numbers because we don't have an agreement. And until we get that agreement, everything we do is at risk. Now, I pick up this morning's paper, and I read that the President and the Speaker and the minority leader in the Senate were all talking about an infrastructure bill yesterday. Wonderful, great, $2 trillion. How about we focus on what matters, which is our really day-to-day budget? Let's get that deal first before we worry about the next one, because we will stumble along this summer, and if we're not careful, we're going to put you guys right back where we've put you until last year for the first time in 10 years, where we actually got you a budget on time and you've had a year to implement it, and believe me, things are better. I see it in the facilities in my district at Fort Sill. I see it at Tinker Air Force Base. Things are better because they had a budget, they could plan, they're moving well on their respective missions. So I just say that, go back to the White House and ask them to sit down and with the appropriate people and get a budget. They are the people responsible for running the country. You can't run it without a budget. I also want to associate myself very much with our subcommittee chairman, the committee of the full thing. This OCO thing is a gimmick. We all know it's a gimmick. I know you have to do. Look, I know who you work for, and I know that OMB, sets these things up. And I've been in enough budget negotiations to know that that's all a budget is, the opening round of a negotiation, and people try to position it. But this is more unrealistic than most initial positions to negotiate from. That is, again, it's not going to stand, and when each side starts off with, I'm going to get everything I want, and you're going to get nothing that you want, nobody's going to get anything. And to wait to the last minute, which I suspect is where we're headed, is a mistake and a disservice to you and the men and women that you lead. We are better. We should be better in governing than that. This is our problem, not yours, but it is an administration problem as well. They have to participate in this, and it's a leadership level, not at this committee. At this committee, if you leave the appropriators to it, they'll get you a deal. I always said if I can put Nita Lowy and Kay Granger in the same room, I'll solve the problem in about an hour. And they'll come out and they'll put us all to work with our respective numbers and what we're supposed to do. And I would just suggest that the leadership of the Congress and the leadership of the administration needs to be as capable as our chairman and our ranking member are. We'll get this done. Again, not your fault, but I hope you carry the message back, because everything else we're doing here is futile.
until we have that deal. We have a number. You guys can plan. We can work with you to get to where we need to go. I do have a question real quickly, if I may, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for indulging me in my rant. But Secretary Shannon, you described an 80% readiness target for mission-critical aviation platforms that you'd like to achieve. I got Tinker Air Force Base in my district. They do wonderful work, great work. They're a big fan of General Kirkland, big fan of General Levy before him. But we ain't anywhere near 80% mission ready in the platforms they're dealing with, or anybody else that I know is dealing with. So again, I want to achieve this goal. What do you need to achieve this goal, and where are we at in reaching that goal?
The 80% target was for F-35s, F-22s, F-16s, and F-18s. The real emphasis was on F-35 and the F-18s. So when we think about B-52s and B-1s, it's an unrealistic goal. So we didn't target those platforms. The F-35s being brand new aircraft, that should be the baseline where we start. So the Navy's made significant progress with the F-18s. I think they're on track to meet the goal in September. I can give you the number, but it's somewhere like they've recovered, 50 to 60 more aircraft in the past 6 months. It's been a tremendous amount of progress. The F-35 will come home. We're gonna drive that home, but we wouldn't set that bar across all of the platforms. F-22 has struggled, and I think the F-16 is a bit of a high bar, but it's a lot of iron to keep on the ground, and given all the training missions and the productivity we can generate, I think holding that standard is smart for now.
Well, I applaud you for the standard, and we'll certainly do everything we can to work with you, because we've got a lot of money invested in these platforms, and we've got a lot of flyers that aren't getting the airtime they need in terms of readiness as well. So, again, just want you to know that's a very high priority for me. I'm sure it is for everybody on the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Acting Secretary and General and Mr. Norquist. Mr. Acting Secretary, the DoD revealed that not only will the Pentagon be sending 320 more troops to the U.S.-Mexico border, bringing the total number to 3,200, but it has also been disclosed that the rules will also be loosened so that some troops can interact with migrants. This represents a significant amount of resources going toward a mission that has no end in sight. How will this perpetual deployment affect troop readiness, and describe how making such a deployment will not interfere with the multitude of missions that the armed forces are already engaged in?
Thank you for that question, and this is an issue that General Dunford and I work on quite a bit, because the question that he and I really are trying to answer is, how long will we be at the border? And so, to date, if you go back in time, we received our first request a little over a year ago in April. And it was, I think, we've really been on this kind of a la carte approach where we've been asked to support DHS. We have. It's, traditional that the department supports civil authorities, whether it's, hurricanes or what have you. We're now in a position where we need to ask the question, how long will we be there? And when we've gone through and looked at the conditions of the border and borders and CBP's ability to actually perform their duty, they're thousands of people short. And so we've initiated a set of actions to really understand kind of how many people are they short, because we need to get that into a sustained environment. We're driving buses, we're serving food, we're doing medical support, we're doing logistics support. For now, we haven't degraded any readiness, but we really need to get back to our primary missions and continue to generate readiness.
Yeah, because the department also presented this committee a list of unfunded requirements totaling $8.3 billion, and the department's estimated $9 billion in hurricane and storm damage that impacts troop readiness and morale as well. Yet the department's overestimation for FY19 end strength resulted in $1 billion, and so you have these two buckets of unfunded requirements and potential disasters to be mitigated, and yet we choose to send $1 billion to a priority that has not been funded. So why, with all of this going on, do we need to send $1 billion in military personnel funding for the president's border wall?
We need to secure the border. I mean, this is a,
I understand that. All of us agree with that.
right.
So why is it your responsibility? Why isn't this not a DHS priority to be worked out with Congress?
The simple version is I have a legal standing order from the Commander-in-Chief to deploy resources to support a national emergency.
Do you feel that you also have a constitutional authority to follow the will of Congress?
I have a legal standing order from the Commander-in-Chief.
So does the department intend to continue to ignore our responsibility for the power of the purse?
We won't ignore,
But you did.
you know, we're following the law. It's within the law for us to be able to utilize these funds. It's within the law. I wouldn't break the law.
Okay. Can we expect anything else within the supplemental related to personnel? Judges, lawyers, drivers, transport, that $377 billion supplemental that the chairman mentioned. What will be contained within that?
Did you say billion or million?
I'm
This is
sorry, it was
million.
million.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
yeah. No. I think it's the.
I don't want to make news there. on
Yeah,
that.
no. Just to be clear, I believe, and I'll ask David to clarify, but that is our estimate for this year. David?
Correct, that's the estimate for the year, but many of the functions that you talked about are those that are ones that we are performing in support of CBP, the bus driving, the food, the others. But the 377, I believe, or just under 400 is the cost associated with the support for the year.
Yeah, I guess I'm still struggling with the policy, Mr. Acting Secretary, on at what level you feel you need to continue to backfill CBP operations. But I'll move on quickly. Could you give us an update on, there's a program of interest to me and a lot of us, the Information Assurance Scholarship Program that performs DoD cyber scholarships. How is it performing currently? Where do you see this going in the future? And how important is it to prepare future cyber warriors within the department?
Right. Well, the scholarship and the recruitment and the retainment of cyber professionals is probably the greatest skill challenge that we have in the department. You know, there aren't enough software engineers in the world, and there probably never will be. The skills that we've developed inside the department are world-class, and the ability to recruit and retain is within Cyber Command, within each of the services, within the NSA, is probably our biggest threat. The scholarship program, I don't know the particulars of its effectiveness. I know that every place where we've put a program in place, it's worked, and we should be doing more.
This program is housed within the Chief Information Officer budget within your office, but it's something that Congress has funded the past few years, and we look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you for that. Yep.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Norquist, General Dunford, thanks again for your service. I join my colleagues up here in congratulating you on a remarkable career. At the risk of beating a dead horse on EHR, but I join my colleague from Texas and my colleague from Kentucky in voicing some concerns about it. But to be fair, it is a shared responsibility. I mean, if you're going to marry platforms from two different cabinet agencies, it's a shared responsibility. So can you enlighten me on what your conversations with Secretary Wilkie have been like in the marriage between these two systems? It seems to take such a long time at such extraordinary expense.
Before undertaking these duties and responsibilities, I spent quite a bit of time with Secretary Shulkin, and then with Secretary Wilkie on putting a governance process in place, but more importantly, making sure that there was enough crosstalk on the requirements in terms of the interfaces and how this data interchange would play. I haven't talked to Secretary Wilkie this year, given these responsibilities. I'll accept the responsibility of the fact we have to go deliver on these systems. I mean, I own it now, but I don't have any other kind of updates other than the ones in the previous where we put the actions that with David Shulkin and with Secretary Wilkie, we identified the critical deficiencies. That's where we spent our time. What are the critical deficiencies and when will they be corrected?
Well, I don't know a lot about the IT community, but I do know this. Former Secretary Shulkin made a decision. At least he was able to make a decision on an acceptable platform, and why we are now this far down the road without any action. As I said, I share the concerns of my colleagues, but I want to talk about another information technology issue, and that is with a simple question: why does your department continue with what I believe to be an ill-conceived strategy on a single vendor JEDI cloud program? There's been a down select to two organizations that, in my strong opinion, continues a disturbing pattern of limiting competition on a program that is potentially extremely expensive. We don't know just how expensive it's going to be, but and I have strong concerns about how the approach by the Department of Defense in this arena seems to be geared toward, producing a desired outcome with a specific vendor. So I'll leave it there, but I'm concerned about JEDI.
Well, digital modernization is probably one of the most important undertakings the department has. So for us to be successful in cyber, we have to be able to protect ourselves. So the cloud is one element of infrastructure that we're modernizing. The fundamental premise on our approach to the JEDI implementation was to have competition. And this is an important underpinning of that competition. Preclude vendor lock. Okay, so we want to be locked into one supplier, just like in the situation we have with electronic health record, have flexibility if things aren't working out. Across the department, there was a proliferation in terms of implementing clouds. Everyone was moving to the cloud. The JEDI competition is about creating a pathway so that we can move as a department on a small scale. This isn't wholesale. It sometimes gets advertised as this is winner take all. This is winner take all for a very small subset of the amount of cloud infrastructure we're going to have to build out over time. Besides creating competition, we're creating the standard processes so that the department can migrate, so that we don't have each and every department trying to figure out how to move to a cloud.
What conversations did you have with the intelligence community? I mean, they've gone, they have the same issue, correct?
Correct.
And they've developed a strategy, correct?
Yep.
From single vendor now to multi-vendor. So was there not an informed pathway established by the IC that has been working in this arena that's going in a totally separate direction than what the Pentagon's going?
Actually, we worked very closely with the agency, and then the person who led that effort has come over to lead the effort in the department, so that we could take what they, the conversations we had with them was, if you could go back in time, what would you do differently? And so we're taking what they learned from their experience and translating it into what we're doing.
Well, all I'll say, and I'll leave the subject, is that it is clear that multi-vendor cloud environments are widely used by large organizations for a simple reason. They increase competition, they improve security and capability, and they provide cost savings. And in an environment like we're in right now, I would assume that that would be a key issue for our Department of Defense. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get to a couple questions, first of all, thanks to the three of you for being here. And I did want to offer an invitation to visit the Rock Island Arsenal. It is literally on an island in the middle of the Mississippi River. And we'd love for you to come, especially to see our new Center for Excellence in Advanced and Additive Manufacturing. So I just wanted to extend that if that would fit into your schedules. So just a couple questions. I'm going to start with looking at the make or buy guidance. And it was in September of 2018 that the department released a report that's called Assessing and Strengthening the Manufacturing Defense Industrial Base and Supply Chain Resiliency. Just rolls off your tongue. So the broad takeaway in that is that the report highlights the need to sustain our organic industrial base elements like depots, the ammo plants, arsenals, in a way to address the supply chain vulnerability and maintain some level of workforce that's needed to address the industrial base needs. So one of the great challenges is the predictability of the workload to maintain and sustain the workforce and make sure that we keep up capabilities. In the Army, this make or buy guidance, it's supposed to inform the procurement officers on their decision to use the private sector or some combination of the private sector and the arsenals. I have some concern about how that's working, and so what I would ask of you is, can you discuss how the department is working with each of the services to ensure that their respective make or buy or equivalent guidance or regulations are addressing the needs and the challenges identified in the report from last September?
Now, the report from last September talks about the investments we need in order to bring work back or to invest in critical capabilities, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So the the specifics of each service and the business case, if you will. I can't speak to case by case. I mean, I'd be happy to make available the people that kind of talk through how that decision, how those decisions are made.
Okay.
I think in terms of the Rock Island Arsenal and arsenals in general, we kind of think about the National Defense Strategy and modernization. There, and this report, there are two big opportunities right now. One is if we're going to bring work back, and there's certain capabilities that are in China, so that would be like at the top of my list.
Okay.
Why don't we make them organic, right? So I mean. That's one, and then the second piece really is, as the Army in particular starts to modernize, we know the surge in industrial support to a lot of these suppliers is going to be quite high. In fact, this predictability, that's another opportunity. And I would just offer we'd be happy to work with Rock Island Arsenal to pursue what I think there are real opportunities in the future where we're not moving work from one place to another. It's really new work.
I don't know, Mr. Norquist or General, if you have anything to add, I would appreciate your thoughts on this as well.
Well, I know that the Army is paying particular attention to this as it affects the Rock Island Arsenal with the up armor of the heavy equipment transporter and other items. But you raise a good point, which is part of what drives the cost of each one of these organizations is what level do I staff to? What's the level of workload that's coming through my organization? When I visited a number of depots, one of the questions I'd ask them is I'd say, look, we have these maintenance backlog issues. What are you hiring up? Are you addressing them? And part of their concern is, well, what's my funding going to look like next year? When am I going to receive it? And so when we talk about the point that Congressman Calvert raised about the budget on time, the CR and so forth, those consequences are not just at our level, they're down at each of those organizations who's trying to plan a level of workload that minimizes the cost. And so I think the Army's working very carefully, particularly with Rock Island, to be able to address that. But as a department, the stability of that information for those organizations allows them to operate at a much more efficient level and at a better cost, and that helps protect the department and the country.
All right, General, anything to add?
I don't have any add on
Okay.
that issue. Thanks, Congressman.
All right, great, thank you. Just one other question. Obviously, it has been well established at this point that foreign entities willfully engaged in and meddled in our elections during both the 2016 and the 2018 elections. This is a clear threat to free and fair elections, a big concern, I think, to probably everybody sitting in front of you, and certainly a big concern in our nation. Regardless of party or political creed, this should be a basic position that we can all agree on, that we need to make sure our elections are free and fair. It's my understanding that the U.S. Cyber Command has already established a track record of working to protect our election, including disrupting internet access for Russian troll factories during the 2018 midterms. This budget requests $9.6 billion to support increased cyber warfare capacity, both offensive and defensive, to ensure we're protecting our country. Here's my question. Could you outline for our committee how this funding will grow capacity at the department to protect our country from further cyber threats and hacks from foreign adversaries? And do you foresee this funding helping provide resources or capacity that could specifically help ensure free and fair elections? And maybe, General, if we start with you and then maybe to the Secretary.
Congresswoman, I think what's a really important point is that probably prior to 2017, we viewed United States Cyber Command as a tool that was used for what we called an away game. A major policy shift that we made in 2017 was to bring the full weight of the United States Cybercom to bear in defending the most important thing to our nation, which is our democratic process. And so you can't separate what Cybercom does in protecting our elections. In other words, in 2018, that was absolutely General Nakasone and the team's #1 priority in the fall of 2018. And as you've suggested, even in this venue, we can say that they had some significant success. And the capabilities that they'll continue to develop will be brought to bear in 2020 and beyond, just like they were in 2018, in support, certainly, of the primary organizations, domestic organizations responsible for elections. But I can assure you that under the Secretary's leadership and his predecessor, our approach was, what's the most important thing right now to our country? Defending our elections. What is United States Cybercom's #1 priority? Defending our elections.
Mr. Secretary?
Now, I would certainly echo what the chairman has said. If we decompose the incremental $9.6 billion in the budget and we were in a classified setting, I would walk you through program by program where that money is going. Last summer, a host of us met with General Nakasone. Over the course of 4 months, we went through and said, what are the future investments that need to be made to stay ahead of the threat? What are the capabilities so that we can get after new threats? And then where do we need more capacity so that we can grow this and address, other areas in the department? So that's the level of detail that's within the budget. But for a while they were being not starved, but I think some of the attention being placed in recovering readiness had limited the growth. That's why this year we have it's an over 10% increase in their funding.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, we've discussed a little bit, and I'll pose this to anyone who wants to answer it at the table. But as you're well aware, there's a significant difference between the FY2020 defense requested funding and the BCA caps if a new deal is not reached. And can you just discuss a little bit about how you see this would impact the department overall, and if there are any contingencies that you currently have in place they would address the funding discrepancy that we would see at such a magnitude?
So I think the core of your question is, what's the effect of a return to sequestration to the Department of Defense? And I think the clear point is it would be catastrophic. When you first thing you'd have is you'd have undone a significant amount of the readiness gain that this Congress and this administration has spent so long investing in. When you realize that you hire about 270,000 military personnel a year, reducing their training, that's a group that needs to go through, needs to get the same level of at both the basic and the advanced training. When that's disrupted, there are consequences. We've seen improvement you know, in the number of Army Brigade combat teams that are ready going from 18 to 28, you'd end up going backwards. Then you'd also have the very point that the Congresswoman over here raised, which is the disruption to every depot, every installation, every organization that provides a service that counts on that level of stability to run Abram tanks or other things through maintenance, now all of a sudden getting a dramatically reduced order that they're still trying to manage with a workforce that was designed for a higher level. So I think it would be disruptive for readiness. It would be a major step back for our security, and it would introduce costs into the system that are unnecessary. And I'll leave it at that unless the chairman or the secretary want to add in.
I would just make the point that it's a 25% cut. And so it's, you know, not something you just do some belt tightening exercise on. And, you know, at a macro level, you'd either decide to invest in modernization and furlough quite a few people and take a lot of risk in terms of security, or maintain current force structure and then forego investment in modernization. But it'd be really, in essence, undoing of the national defense strategy.
Congressman, as we have the debate, I think probably in simple terms, we ought to look at it really in three categories. One is it's about the support we provide for our men and women in harm's way. That's going to be impacted. Two is it's our ability to deter potential adversaries. That's where we're going to see the impact. And three, it's our ability to respond if deterrence fails. So this is fundamental to our strategy. In other words, appropriate level of resourcing in this budget and the last two budgets have been directly and inextricably linked to our ability to execute the national defense strategy and sustain that competitive advantage I alluded to in my opening remarks. And I don't have any doubt that our competitive advantage will continue to erode and put at risk our ability to project power when and where necessary to advance our national interests in the future, were we to go back to the BCA. There is absolutely no question in my mind about that.
Thank you. Let me just shift gear just a second. It seems that after a meeting last December, each of the service branch now has its own hypersonic offensive weapon program, but we're waiting for new boosters to be developed. We have boosters already in production of a 50-inch size, my understanding. If there is a study that claims that these boosters are too expensive, could our office get some detailed information on that particular issue? And I think if possible, it would be best to field a limited number of weapons using what we have now. My office has been discussion with Dr. Mike Griffith with your office, and of course, just encourage you to reach out to him because I think he has some real insight on that.
We'd be happy to do that. And as you know, Dr. Griffin is leading the effort to make sure that we leverage as much commonality between the three services in terms of bodies, boosters, energetics, you know, as many things as we can to be able to accelerate our deployment of hypersonics. But we'd be happy to coordinate with your office.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary, and Mr. Norquist, and General Dunford. Thank you for your lifetime of service to the Marine Corps and to our country and to your fealty to the oath that you've taken. We respect your service very much. Secretary Shanahan, thank you so very much for your openness to meeting with members of this committee. On the issue of hypersonics, could you please provide to us the future year defense plan for hypersonic test chamber funding and the sites associated with future funding, the factors that were weighed in the selection of the 3 test tunnels, and also I understand that the department is willing to consider other sites that would be less expensive, that are fully equipped, and prior to making final decisions. Is that my understanding?
I believe so. I've done some homework since you and I have met, and the the basic selection criteria in determining where to do the hypersonic testing looks at existing capability, whether it's mothballed or not. Just what is it'd be like the size of a wind tunnel or basic performance. Then there's existing infrastructure, and then realism of being able to have a representation of what a flight environment would look like. I know that our team is going to take a visit to Plumbrook And maybe it's serendipity, but it was actually this week. So I know there's been some selections this year, and then there's ongoing studies in 20. The exact funding I'd have to get back to you
All right.
with.
I just thank you for the dialogue and your interest. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask General Dunford or any of the panelists, what more can the United States and our free world allies do to gird Ukraine for the upcoming winter season against the possibility of Russia turning off the gas?
Congresswoman, I can talk to what we're doing to help Ukraine defend itself, and I think you know we're providing defensive weapons and capability. We're also providing them cyber expertise. I don't have any details on exactly what we're doing or what we might do to help them with their fuel problem in the wintertime. We can take that for the record and get back to you.
I would be very grateful for that. I'd like to know if there's any thinking anywhere along the lines regarding that. I also, General, in the budget that has been submitted, you specifically referred to the Intrepid Center, which I am so impressed with. My question is, are there additional funds in this budget to replicate that in other places in the country? And again, I have to speak for my region, where we don't have big bases. We have Guard and Reserve who also come home, who are wounded warriors, including on the behavioral side. Is there any funding? How does one replicate some of the superb work that's being done at the Intrepid Center in other places in the country?
I'll take the first crack at it, Congressman. First, thanks to some help. Those were privately funded by the Fisher Foundation, so the actual infrastructure was provided to the Department of Defense. What you'll see in the budget, of course, is the funding for the medical support that goes into those facilities. And so we're always in a competition. The Secretary spoke earlier about human capital for cyber. We're in a fight for human capital for some of the medical specialties that are necessary to field these multidisciplinary medical facilities as well. And so in the budget, and we can get you the exact details, where you see requests for medical support, a piece of that will be to support not only, I use the NICO, but that's not the only multidisciplinary approach. Each of the services has been moving in that direction in a comprehensive way over the last couple of years, and that's part of the budget.
I would just point out that nationwide we have a severe shortage of psychiatrists, over 100,000, and in the behavioral arena among advanced practice nurses and behavioral specialists, probably 5 times that much. Our chaplain corps is burned out, in my opinion. And when we had the heads of West Point, Annapolis Air Force Academy before our subcommittee, I was quite disappointed when I asked them the question, when you recruit for young people to come into the officer corps, do you have a level of physicians, the individuals who might be interested in medical careers? And I asked them how many each of them had graduated, and the number was generally 5 or under. I was actually shocked at their lack of connectivity on this particular issue, but also the responsibility that they might assist with as we try to help the military. So I just make you aware of that conversation. And finally, though none of my colleagues may agree with me on this, I just wanted to express an opinion about our border. I live way at the northern border. But in terms of the southern border, I think that what we are facing is a series of failed states and people who are fleeing for reasons that the United States is not responsible for. After World War II, we, through the military, and I am very uncomfortable with the U.S. military deploying to our southern border. That's a slippery slope. But there is some experience in the military with displaced persons camps. And if one looks at resettlement and the proper care of individuals, the military really does have some remarkable history on that in Europe. And I think that the United Nations, through their resettlement programs, we need a diplomatic solution here, not just a policing solution. And I don't see that developing, and I think we could really do something remarkable working with our Canadian allies, with our Australian, Costa Rican, you name it. We could help people find safety. And I don't see that happening. I see a lot of political argument and all the rest. And the human side of this is getting lost. But maybe the military, based on its experience with large numbers of people who were displaced for reasons dealing with war, the world was transformed by that moment. And I think there's some history there that needs to be relearned. So I just wanted to state that, and I thank you for your testimony this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today. We appreciate the wisdom you bring to us and the information we're able to gather from you. General Dunford, it's really been a pleasure and an honor to work with you, and wish you great success in the future. I'd like to talk about the Futures Command, which just has been stood up in Austin, Texas, to the south of my district last August. It's designed to reorganize the Army and address procurement requirements and warfighting concepts. 8 cross-functional teams are focusing on the Army's top priorities of long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, networks, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality. These Army modernization efforts are the service's largest reorganization in 30 years and focus on both the unit structure and the equipment required to address both great power and non-state actor threats. Now, as we put this together, we've got a lot of questions that we need to I think need to be raised. And let me state from the outset, I'm very excited about the Futures Command, and I think the modernization is long overdue in the procurement area, if no other place. But as you look at what we've done so far and what they're dealing with, I know they're working extremely hard to stand up as quickly as possible their command down there. Are you concerned that the Army may be moving too quickly? Are they putting speed ahead of thoughtful planning? Who in the department is overseeing the Army's requirements process as well as their procurement activities? The Army is proposing to eliminate, delay, or cancel 186 existing programs to shift funding to future modernization. What happens if Congress doesn't approve the plan? How do these decisions affect the overall defense industrial base, particularly small businesses? The Army has a recent history of large and costly acquisition failures. Future Combat Systems, $21.4 billion, invested from 2000 to 2009 and then canceled. The Comanche helicopter, $110 billion invested from 88 to 04 and then canceled. The Army is embarking on another round of heavy investment in the future technology. What do you perceive to be the difference this time?
I'm assuming that's a question for me, or many questions. First of all, and I've had a number of conversations with Chairman Visklosky on this subject, so maybe I'll talk about kind of the 3 big challenges as I see them. Let's maybe start with I'll give the Army credit for the fact that they have a modernization plan. Let's just say that those 6 elements that you've identified are the right ones. And then I have a lot of confidence in General Murray and the team that he's been putting in place around him. There's, when I just broadly look at what they're undertaking, it's more right now about execution than it is about strategy. And if I was going to, there's 1,000 tasks that we have to undertake, but if there were three major tasks that I would undertake, the first one is, how are they setting their requirements? So let's use long-range precision fires as an example. When they determine both range and cost, against, the Russians or the Chinese, are they making sure that we've got the right range and enough growth? And if we go all the way down through, vertical lift, networks, whatever they choose as those requirements, they have to win. So if we get that part wrong on the front end, and that's where we've been putting in a lot of support around General Murray, because if you just go through the Army, no one's there that has done any development. It's been 30 years, so you left the Crusader out. But there's this whole list, litany of these failed programs, and so that's why I worry about the execution piece. The programmatics is going to be the bread and butter, but if we get the requirements wrong, it's game over. The part where we've spent time with Chairman Visklosky is, if you're going to develop all this new capability, how do you transition out of the current industrial base, all the programs? That's the real work that has to be done now, because you're making bets. If you take too much schedule risk, and then you don't achieve that, and we've already told employees that we're going to change the industrial base. I mean, that's unfair to them. I mean, there's a whole bunch of complexities here. I think that's where the Army is right now. I spent a lot of time with Dr. Esper, General Milley, but I mean, this is like, collectively, this is as big a program as you're going to find. This is where we all have to really help. We have to help the Army. I know we can shine a spotlight on the things that they need to do, but we really need to help them because it's such a large undertaking. But that's how I've been, really working with, especially General Murray and the Army.
And it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that part of what you plan to do is utilize knowledge both from industry and from academia as it relates to certain areas of the Futures Command. I agree absolutely. General Murray is the right person in the right place. He's quite effective man, and so I'm very proud of him, and I think he's going to do a fantastic job. But you got to have big shoulders to bear this thing up, because it's going to be a new concept. I'm very hopeful because if you look at industry versus government, industry is all about a bottom line, and it all has to do with profit and loss. And so therefore they are looking in detail about everything. And I think as we re-look at how we procure things, and I know that we've been discussing this for a long time, I think we might actually become a more effective purchaser and a more effective warfighter by doing it. But it is a big job, and whatever resources that we can put to help, we need to know about those resources. And I know you've put a lot already into it, but I hope we will continue to inform this committee as to what resources you need so this can be a success. We don't want this to be a gigantic failure. We want it to be a gigantic success. So I love the great out-of-the-box thinking, and I hope it rewards us very well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman raising the issue, and Mr. Secretary, I do appreciate your comments. It is much easier to go down that new road, very exciting road, as programs get adjusted and dissipate. Those are very difficult problems to address, and I appreciate your serious approach to it in bringing that up today. I really do.
First, okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, again, one of the key war heroes we have in this present time. These are some of those dangerous times, and your leadership has been fantastic, and I just want to acknowledge that. Acting Secretary, I appreciate your candor, your direct answers to questions, and your reaching out to all of us. And, I just hope that the theme, when it comes to national security, it's USA first. And if we can just live by that, we'll have our issues, but that's extremely important. And now, what I want to get into, over the last few years, our committee has discussed old and new threats facing our nation, including nuclear weapons. In my opinion, if Russia, China, and the United States get into a nuclear war, the earth is over as we know it. We can still, in my opinion, deal with, and what I know, deal with Iran and North Korea. Now, whether it is due to the development of lower-yield nuclear weapons, armed control treaties being broken, nuclear proliferation, or questioning what does and does not warrant nuclear response, I don't think there's any doubt that this threat, again, is severe. I also do not think the solution is for the United States to unilaterally disarm or not to develop certain type of weapons. If you look at world history, if you are weak, you can be taken and might be taken over. So I believe since World War II, we have not had a world war, and I just think we need to go on the course we are, and that's why this committee is trying to do what we can to help. And I do want to raise the issue, too, of sequestration. I've tried to answer the question since sequestration with every admiral and general. And each and every one, including you all today, have said sequestration is probably one of the most severe problems that we've had. It's made our military weaker. It's hurt us in many, many ways. Hypersonics were behind the eight ball in these areas, the Russia and China, because of sequestration. And shame on all of us, Republicans and Democrats, if we continue to allow that ever to kick in again. So that's just a good message, and I'm glad you're there. Now, the United States, again, must maintain that nuclear deterrent. However, what concerns me is the degraded ability of the United States and countries such as Russia and China, or even North Korea, to de-escalate conflict before it leads to nuclear exchange. Now, while our military has effectively deconflicted situations in Syria with the Russian military, I worry that our civilian military leaders do not have the same level of communication and understanding with their counterparts. Misunderstood or unintended signals can have consequences, and there is no argument that our relations with certain countries, especially Russia, have frayed in recent years. Now, my questions. Can, Mr. Secretary or General, can you gauge your ability to effectively communicate with your Russian, Chinese, or even North Korean or Iranian counterparts? Tensions have increased with these countries over the last few years. Has this reduced our ability to effectively communicate with our counterparts, and are there additional resources or authorities you need from Congress to ensure you can effectively communicate with your counterparts to de-escalate in case a situation should arise?
Maybe we'll do a two-part answer. The formal channels to do communication with the Russians have been in place for quite some time, and they're really on a military-to-military basis. With the Chinese, we don't have that capability. And in a second, I'll ask Chairman Dunford to speak to some of his recent activities and trips to China on how we're building that foundation. It's the North Koreans, it's through UN diplomatic channels that the communications take place. But maybe, Chairman, you can talk about your most recent visit to China.
Congressman, maybe just to compare and contrast. So since I've been on my assignment, I've met with my Russian counterpart 4 times on a full range of issues. We communicate very routinely, despite the difficulty in our political relationship. We've maintained our communication out of the political spotlight, and I'm confident we have the ability to mitigate the risk of miscalculation and manage a crisis with Russia. With China, for more than a decade, we attempted to create a formal framework to do the same, with lessons learned from our Russian experience. When I went to China last year, they agreed to a joint staff mechanism where we would have direct communication between the Chinese and the United States. I am not confident that that's where it needs to be right now. It is a priority for us. We need to improve that. With some initial progress we had last fall, things have slowed down a little bit, and we've reached back out to the Chinese to try to get, in fact, I wanted my Chinese counterpart to come to visit the United States this spring. It's their turn, if you will, to come and visit. So I think that's an area that we need to particularly work on. In the meantime, we'd have to rely on diplomatic channels. We don't mirror image in terms of organizational construct or communications the Chinese, and we have to work our way through that as well.
A lot of it has to do with kinetic, but one of the areas with China, and we know how much aggressive they are in cyber. And have you looked or worked with maybe someone from NSA who might have a relationship in that regard also?
Well, we have, Congressman, had conversations with them at every level. And again, I think we're probably better than we were 2 or 3 years ago in terms of communications, but it moves very slowly. There's a lot of suspicion on both sides, and frankly, the Chinese system does not move as fast as maybe we would like.
Thank you. You'll bet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary and Deputy Secretary and General, privileged to be able to participate with you. And General, again, I just want to add my words to what you've heard from my colleagues, words of just great admiration and gratitude. And I hope,
because, I represent Florida. It's a great place to spend time. So I'm hoping that you're looking seriously at particular certain parts of South Florida, which...
California's better.
Florida in the winter.
Yeah, all right, we have a disagreement among the committee members. Let me, the ranking member already mentioned the Space Force, which is something that also, and I've spoken to the deputy about that, and deputy secretary. Let me bring up the issue, another issue that concerns me, and that's for the first time since 2001, the department has really pushed the Air Force, what I believe is a step backwards to invest in this new fourth generation aircraft. The problem is that when I've looked at the numbers, they don't seem to add up. The aircraft will likely, from what I've seen, cost the same or more than the much more advanced F-35. It doesn't align with the national defense strategy, and it clearly doesn't align with congressional intent to, again, recapitalize the Air Force's fighter fleet with fifth-generation aircraft. And in fact, I think it looks like this proposed shift in force structure has, again, I think, huge ramification for the future. And so, as I said before, the numbers don't add up. From what I can see, Lockheed Martin has a capacity to produce 42 additional airplanes by the time that the first two F-15s are in testing. By 2024, which is when the F-15 is supposed to be delivered, the cost per flying hours, from what I can see, is projected to be, frankly, less for the F-35. So in every measurement that I've been able to do, apples to apples, cost, delivery, everything, not to mention, obviously, which to me is the overriding issue, survivability. There's no comparison. And so here's what I would like, if possible, Mr. Secretary, is, not to do it today, but I would like somebody to kind of sit down with us and to really do a apples to apples. I know it's not an easy thing to do necessarily, but an apples to apples comparison on, obviously, the first question is, look, I said this to the Deputy Secretary, I have a 13-year-old son. My God, imagine the privilege if, when he gets older, he would decide to do what, these amazing human beings which sacrifice and they join the U.S. military, right? If he was a pilot, do I want him to be in a fourth-generation airplane or a fifth-generation airplane? That's a no-brainer. But on top of that, even disregarding that, the numbers seem to be much better for the F-35 than this new fourth-generation plane. And so that's just point number one that I hope that somebody can get back to me. And so I don't need a comment now. I just do need somebody to get back to me because, I don't know if anybody does have a comment.
Absolutely, Congressman. We will get back to you with the information and walk you through at the detailed level.
On the flip side, the light attack aircraft. And so, I have had some meetings, not the meeting that I had with the Deputy Secretary, who I think was highly productive, by the way, so thank you, sir. But I've had some meetings before, I won't mention with who, to try to get some answers as to what happened there. And since I've been in Congress, it's probably one of the, again, not the meeting that I've had with the gentleman here, but others, probably the worst meetings I've ever had. I'm still waiting for some answers. Have not gotten answers on what happened there, the decision-making that took place there, to, in essence, kind of pull back on what seemed to be something moving forward. And so I've expressed those concerns privately. I just wanted to, again, hopefully ask if I could get a response, a detailed response, so we can look at it responsibly to figure out what happened there and how that decision was taking place.
Absolutely. We look forward to getting together with you.
And I appreciate that. I will go back to, again, I have some issues about, some comments about the Space Force, but I don't want to abuse of my time. So I do look forward to getting some real answers. And again, I will end this round by, again, General, thanking you for your service. Just our gratitude, as you can hear from all of us, is sincere. So thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. A couple questions. One, I want to kind of follow up on Mr. Rupersberger's question with regard to China. Just following the Belt Road Initiative, following everything you're doing, and I think the defense strategy really captured the great power competition that we're all talking about now. One of the questions I want to talk about and ask is the proliferation of the 5G services. In March, Italy agreed to 29 deals worth $2.8 billion related to the Belt Road Initiative. Just last weekend, the UK reportedly agreed to permit Huawei to build non-core parts of Britain's 5G network. Secretary Pompeo has been blunt that America may not be able to operate in certain environments if there is Huawei technology adjacent to it. General Dunford, in an article in Roll Call, cites you as saying that if London decides to proceed with Huawei's equipment, intelligence cooperation between the two countries could be undermined. Can you elaborate on those comments, specifically on the threat to U.S. national security by the expansion of Huawei building 5G networks at home or with our allies, and also if you can touch upon your comments with regard to the UK?
Sure, Congressman, we start with, as you saw in the National Defense Strategy, we view allies and partners as a source of strength. It's critical to us, and I think we all agree on that. And one of the things that underlies an alliance is the ability to share information. And when we share information with allies and partners, we have to have common standards of information assurance. We have to be sure that our secrets are protected, whether it be intelligence or technology transfer, those things have to be. And so in this venue, what I would say is that as we look forward, whatever decisions we make individually, whatever countries decide to do, it has to be informed by where we want to be on the backside of the new network. And if that network, if we're not mutually assured that that network is secure and we can exchange information, it's going to impede our ability to be allies and to share information as freely as we have in the past.
I mean, that seems devastating if with the UK we can't have the deepest level of cooperation.
Well, this is the argument that the Secretary has been quite vocal about in doing that. Again, I just outlined that this is less about an IT issue than it is about the very connectivity between allies.
Yeah.
Maybe just a comment here about the nature of competition with China. What you see with Huawei is dumping, right? I mean, the integration of civil and military and the state-owned enterprises in China allow them to have price advantage in the marketplace. And so economics supersedes security. And that's what you're seeing in many of these countries as they make their decisions. The telecommunications industry has more influence in policymaking. And in our country, as we start to look at, and this is going to show up in rural infrastructure.
Yeah.
How do we protect ourselves? Because the way I think about this is, can you trust the network? There's a lot of technical, language that goes along with Huawei and others, but it's really, can you trust the network? And if we're going to exchange information, you can see how much more. With 5G, we're going to have billions of devices connected to the internet, and if you can't trust what's on the network, and cyber is so important, we're really disadvantaging ourselves. It's easy to say what we're against. We have to put together a solution for our own country. In the past, we would, with 4G, we dominated because we could put together the ecosystem. I think that's what we need to be doing holistically. We've got some programs going within the Department of Defense. I've had conversations with Chairman Pai, the FCC, but really collectively, we as a country need to have a whole of government effort here. And it plays into 6G. I mean, this just really is part of our future, but it's critical.
I mean, that's my concern. I'm sure it is, just from reading the defense strategy, the whole of government approach that China does. Now, when I started in Congress, and it still happens, they dump steel. Right. Oil country tubular products are coming in, and they're dumping it and putting our steel workers out of business. Now they're doing the same thing with the advanced technologies, and we've got to figure out how to use the whole of government approach, including our private sector, to start dealing with this. So we want to be partners with you as we walk down this road together. Just a couple other questions. One, with regard to suicide prevention, we continue to see what's happening with our veterans. We've seen suicides. Two weeks ago, 3 veterans killed themselves at VA facilities, and just this weekend we had another vet in Ohio. And you're kind of the last, sometimes, because most of these vets don't go to the VA, so you're kind of the last stop for them with any kind of connectivity. What are you doing to ensure these service members receive the support they need for the mental health issues that many of them are dealing with?
I could start, Congressman, and frankly, with your help and the interest of others, as you know, we've increased the access to mental health care significantly over the last few years, and you've been tracking this probably 8 or 9 years now, reduced the stigma. And I really do believe that that particular issue is largely behind us, certainly much more so than it has been in the past, where people are willing to. What I spoke about earlier was breaking down the barriers, and I'm convinced each of the services are working towards doing this. But one of the things that I've seen in my own experience is that not everybody has a complete sight picture of an individual. So if they're seeing a chaplain for help, or they're seeing a leader for help, or they're going to seek mental health care, there isn't a way to see all elements of that individual's life, and that's one of the areas that I think the services have made significant progress, is breaking down those barriers so we can see the indicators of mental health challenges, and then intervene when those things are there. And I think the other significant area that we've made progress in is alerting. These individuals are never alone, and there's always somebody that knows something. And alerting peers to intervene as well, and to alert leadership. And for the examples the sad examples you raised, the suicides, I could give you many examples of where young Marine soldiers, sailors, or airmen have actually seen a change in the behavior of one of their buddies, and they've actually raised that to leadership and done what we call a save. And they've identified somebody who was suicidal and brought it to our attention. So despite all that progress, we're not satisfied with the overall outcome. But I would tell you, I'm closer to the end of the beginning, has been alluded to here. When I look at where we were when I was Assistant Commander of the Marine Corps in 2010, and where we are today in the department in terms of dealing with mental health, our awareness of mental health, our efforts to try to improve the process, and more importantly, to elevate the issues so that people are comfortable talking about it and seeking help, I think we've made a lot of progress. I'm by no means complacent or satisfied with where we are, but the trajectory that we've been on is I think, the right trajectory. And with your continued help in resourcing these programs that we spoke about, we'll continue to make progress.
Great, thank you. Got a lot of work to do. Mr. Secretary, one last quick question, parochial issue. The Missile Defense Review that was released January 2019, at that time, no decision was made on the third ground-based Continental U.S. Interceptor. We, at Camp Garfield in my district, is one of the top 3 choices for the East Coast Missile Defense Site, and the site would create 2,300 jobs where we desperately need them in Northeast Ohio. The environmental impact study was completed, and as I understand it, there's no other impediments to making a decision on the third site. Has a decision been made on this at all, or can you update me?
Yeah, no, I believe a decision is made, and before I say what the decision is made, let me just check that I'm current.
Let's break news right now.
Yeah.
No?
No, I've done that before. It doesn't always go my way. So, but I'll get you an answer today. How about that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would simply want to support the gentleman's conversation about Buy America, not exclusive to the issue of steel, but products, and especially when you think about technology and our dependence. I do think it's an important issue. Mr. Quayer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank all 3 of y'all for your service. I want to talk about the border. I live at the border, and I appreciate folks like y'all that come and visit us once in a while, but I want to make sure you don't take a 5-minute or couple-hour visit and tend to know better than some of us live on the border, and I say that very respectfully. Putting concertina wire on some of our international bridges, let's say Laredo, largest inland port, 16,000 trailers a day, safer, about 3-4 times safer than Washington, D.C., is a little insulting to us. But doing some of the work that I spoke to the Deputy Secretary yesterday that would be very helpful, that the military can help, is addressing the Carrizo cane. And I didn't bring any pictures, but I showed it to the Deputy. That would be very helpful. That's an invasive plant that grows along the river in Texas on both sides, and I wish the Mexicans would do their part also. But that would be one area that y'all can go and clear up, whatever 50 yards, whatever the CBP feels that we need to have, because otherwise cameras, sensors, drones aircraft, helicopters, whatever, they won't be able to penetrate because it's very thick and it grows very, very fast. So I would ask you to consider doing that. That would be extremely helpful for the line of sight for CBP. I would ask you to take a look at that. Changing subjects to Latin America, you know, I get concerned that in places like Mexico and Chile and other countries, when they poll, China and other countries are doing better than we are for various reasons. So we need to have a better presence there. I know last year we did the Indo-Pacific Initiative, and one of the things I also spoke to the Deputy Norquist yesterday is for y'all to consider whatever we want to call it, Plan Latin America, where we also do training and education, not militarize the border, Latin America, because there is a lot of sensitivities there, but there's a lot of things that we can do, and I believe I gave some information to the Secretary, to the Deputy Secretary, and I would ask you to take a look at that. We're working with the with the Armed Services, the NDAA, to look at that, but I would ask you to take a look at it. And finally, my last question, and ask you to respond to all three of them, the Department of Defense Inspector General just found out that DOD continues paying excessive profits on parts purchased from sole source manufacturers and providers. And again, I don't have a problem vendors making money. I'm for that. But I do have a problem when, 46 out of 47 parts that they looked at had excessive profits, where they went from 17 to 4,451%, according to the IG, and I would ask you to take a look at it. I'm a big supporter of what y'all do, but when you have vendors losing parts, when you have all this excessive profits that are made, and I'm a capitalist, I just feel that the taxpayers are being taken advantage of. So, Mr. Chairman, I know this is my last series of questions, but I would ask you to look at those three items that I just mentioned. Border would be something that y'all, if you're going to do that, clear the line of sight for it, and you can put a lot of technology in those areas and probably do a lot more.
I'm happy.
One at a time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. No. Clearly on making simple improvements to visibility is something we need to work with CBP with. Our role in Concertina Wire has been to support their requests. Obviously, we can provide input to them as to these are other things that can and should be done.
Yeah, the Carrizo cane elimination and the river roads to provide access would be, in my opinion, in talking to the men and women there literally on a weekly basis, because I live there, would be tremendous. I mean, I'd be happy to follow up with Secretary Norquist and go into more details.
And then in terms of South America, the chairman and I spent a lot of time with Admiral Fowler there in Southcom, and he looks at that region through a lot of different lenses, but one of the forums that we've now included him into is our China forum. Because, like you said, the Chinese are everywhere. I mean, they're practicing their predatory economics where, they promise, great things with infrastructure, and all of a sudden you can't pay for them, and they've done all the work, and, your debt levels are very high. Most of the investment in their countries is direct foreign investment by private companies. So as a country, we don't get, the same kind of credit the Chinese do. Admiral Fowler, as part of our national defense strategy, is working with allies and partners. So in working with the Colombians and the Brazilians, we go down the list. How is it that we want to collaborate with them so that we can address some of these, they really are threats? And then how do we counter the narrative where we're really a value-based society, and the type of the way the Chinese, the practices they bring are very much different than what we have to offer. And we'd be happy to work with you on some of the language that you've been developing. The military to military and some of the other kind of programs that we have established is invaluable in terms of how we strengthen those relationships. And then lastly, on the paying over market. Wish it was a criminal offense because we shouldn't. And I feel just as passionately about it as you do. We should pay fairly. People
Correct.
should make a profit because they earn it,
Right.
and we shouldn't be overcharged.
Thank you. My time is up, but I want to thank all three of y'all and Chairman Dunford. Thank you for your time. But all of y'all, thank you. I want to be very supportive of what y'all do and your men and women do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for being here. Appreciate your presence. Secretary Shanahan, I, along with a lot of people, have been following the recent developments in Venezuela, and I'm concerned with how the situation has deteriorated, and wondered if you could speak to your views as acting secretary, what the situation is, and what else we may know.
We, as you're tracking, it's extraordinarily fluid, and it's almost day to day. What I would tell you is that later today, Chairman Dunford and I will be over with Ambassador Bolton, Secretary Pompeo, and Secretary Mnuchin's traveling. But we are working this as a whole of government, and when people say there are, all options are on the table, they literally are. But we work it as much diplomatically and economically to impose pressure. We've got the Cubans there, we've got the Russians, the Chinese, so on many dimensions, and not all of them are visible through the media and other channels. We're really turning up the game. This is not a timetable we control. Right. And to the degree we can respond and alter our tactics and take advantage of the situation, and we have been. I don't know, Chairman, if you want to add a comment or two. We've done exhaustive planning, so there's not a situation or a scenario that we don't have a contingency for. I would also offer that we're in close partnership with Colombia and Brazil. We're taking a regional approach. This isn't just, the United States showing up, but
yes, sir.
Taking the security situation very seriously.
Well, as I understand it, I think there's 50 nations that are supporting Guaido.
54 Guaido, yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
General, did you have anything to add?
The only point I was going to make, Congressman, the Secretary got at the end, is that the one thing that Admiral Fowler, and I'm now speaking to the military dimension of the problem, as the Secretary said,
yes, sir.
It's been primarily diplomatic and economic with planning militarily, and then, as you know, we've moved humanitarian assistance down there, and obviously we have intelligence capabilities. But the one thing that Admiral Fowler has really led on, and I think well in this regard, is a multilateral approach. And so our communications with others in the region, I think it really is very, very important that we work with others in the region to solve this problem. Someone before you mentioned U.S. influence in the region. And what I have seen in unclassified surveys that have been done lately is actually U.S. influence in the region, and the perception of United States in the region is actually moving in the right direction. The trends are in the right direction. And I think as we manage the crisis in Venezuela, we need to manage it in a way that continues that trend as well. And that's, I think, what we've done to date, and certainly what the direction and the guidance from the President has been to us.
Well, thank you very much.
The gentleman yield just for
Of course.
follow on that.
Certainly.
Has Mexico changed their position yet as far as their continued support of Maduro?
I don't believe so.
That's disappointing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your service to the country and being on top of the situation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary, I have three items I'd like to touch on, and then for the members who are here to give them a second opportunity. The department will be releasing its annual report on sexual assault at some point in time in the near future. But I would note that sexual assault reports have spiked to an all-time high in 2017, and only 3% resulted in convictions. Not knowing about any one of those instances, 3% may be exactly right, but it makes me wonder. In 2015, the Pentagon survey indicated that 40% of the victims reported that their command encouraged them to drop their complaint. with the report to due soon, and I appreciate that you gentlemen are committed to dealing with this issue. That is societal, but it is a problem at the department. Could you just very briefly touch on that, and are there any additional efforts or conversations that are taking place to deal with this issue?
Sure. I'd be happy to address, and then each of my counterparts can, weigh in. So, first of all, any sexual assault is one too many. No matter what the, the number is, the only number that matters is zero. And in this world where we're in a competition for talent, if that's the kind of treatment you get, it makes it really hard to compete for talent. So the numbers aren't in a place that's acceptable. The two areas of focus for us are, one, the system itself. Is it, think of it as due process. Is there sufficient resources? Is there accountability? Is the threat of retaliation mitigated? There's a number of these things, and I think what you'll find shortly, and Mr. Ryan's gone, but this would be news breaking. We're going to criminalize certain activities in this next year to reflect the seriousness that we're going to take on certain behaviors. So there's an element of how do we make the system that we have, and our system is broad because we do we're responsible for every dimension of our servicemen and women's behavior. The third piece, which is really when you break down the numbers, whether you want to do a heat map or the detailed analytics, is the behavior of certain populations. And we know, and when you see the sexual assault report, you'll see that there's a targeted, there's an opportunity to really work the behavior, and that comes from leadership teaching certain age groups what's acceptable and what's not, and I think that's a real opportunity for us.
I appreciate your comment. That would satisfy me. I appreciate the initiative because I am very concerned about the issue of retaliation. I think everybody on the committee is. The second item, and it's not really a question, but it just literally was a topic of conversation when the Navy testified yesterday. Between the United States Navy and the Marine Corps, there is a waiting list for daycare of over 8,000 sailors and Marines. And what was distressing is that the Department of the Navy would increase spending by $7 million this year, but ask for no new capacity. The Marine Corps, in their budget, would be spending less than they did 2 years ago on the issue with no new capacity. We're going to be marking up in 2 weeks from today in subcommittee and simply indicated to the Secretary Chief, and I don't have the Air Force and Army figures in front of me, that there's no way of telling if I'm going to be on this planet tomorrow morning, let alone next year when we have a hearing. And just want in fiscal year 2020, for the sake of these people who are desperate for daycare, to somehow work with your department and get something done despite what the pending budget request is. The third item I have, and it's a very serious concern to me, is budget justifications. And I would just give a couple of examples and ask for a response. Obviously, we have a new proposal from the department for the Space Force. That's about $72.4 million. Space Development Agency, $149.8 million, and the Space Command, $83.8 million. The Space Force gives an estimate for the cost over the next 5 years, but of the three, it is the only one that gives us that extended estimate. It is $2 billion. The details for the actual implementation of the Space Force are yet to be developed, as I understand it, as evidenced by the request for transfer authority for funding for a 5-year period with an additional 2-year option as part of a legislative proposal. And again, it's easy to spend money this year and then we're stuck. We have the issue of a $250 million request for the implementations for the reorganization of military health personnel. Details are to be submitted later this summer. Our bill is going to be done on May 15th, and of course, then we have the process ahead of us. I would indicate that during our hearing in March for one of the agencies, there was a one-page justification for an expenditure of some significant sum of money. And when I asked the witness when the supporting documentation for the one page of justification would be presented to the committee, we were told mid-April, which was a completely unsatisfactory answer. I have in front of me a paragraph that is a request for a new program for $242 million. I have another paragraph for a program for $250 million. And I appreciate that there are changes, and I appreciate that there's a sense of urgency at the department that I've not seen in my tenure here. But we have a responsibility from a budget standpoint to see details. And whether Secretary or Mr. Norquist, I am not happy. Some departments, agencies have been very fulsome, very cooperative, but it is uneven and, from my perspective, incomplete. And looking ahead, we are where we are today in 20. What should I expect for 21? To put it as my good friend, former Chairman Frelinghuysen would say, I think it has been lacking.
So if you are unhappy then on the budget justification material, then clearly I will be unhappy with the level of you've been receiving. I'm glad to hear that some are meeting, but to those who aren't, my answer is let me know and I will follow up. Our concern is always that you need to have the same level of information to do the oversight that OSD would over the services or over the others. What is it for? What is the need? What's the requirements? What are the alternatives? Those types of things. We tend to produce 116 volumes worth of budget data. It fills entire bookshelves. Much of that is routine, but there are certain areas that become a particular focus, and making sure that you have the adequate level and the appropriate level of justification for those is essential. I appreciate your point about the balancing with the speed, but even with speed, we still need to get you the data. So we look forward to working with you on any of the examples you brought up to be able to make sure that we can address those questions. But that's an essential function that both of our organizations have to be able to adequately address, so you can have confidence in where you're assigning taxpayers' money, and you can have confidence in what you're investing in and what the long-term implications of that are.
And again, in some instances, it's been very good. In others, it has been very lacking. And I would point out, for the record, that we were on time. This was the first year in some time we were on time. And in fact, not anyone's fault in this room, there was a delay in another 5 weeks for the submission of the budget. So there was plenty of time this year. There was predictability. So that's why I, again, find it particularly upsetting in some instances. Ms. Calvert?
Mr. Chairman, I'll just have one line of questioning about you brought up the Space Force. And I recognize we've had these discussions. I talked to Mike Griffin this morning about the space development portion of it. And it's true that this new dimension is something that we need to move on as quickly as possible. I really don't have a real problem other than how this Space Force is put together and how we pay for it, as far as the Space Force part of it. And the combatant commander is necessary, and I understand that portion of it. I'm following very closely, I had a very good discussion with Mike this morning, the space development part of it. And that's done properly and that we have transparency on how we do that. That improved today, and I appreciate that. So we'll be keeping track of that. As the chairman pointed out, I thought it was a secret we were marking up on May 15th. It's not a secret anymore, Mr. Chairman, right?
Forget I said it.
But we have a very short timeline, so any information that we need to have, we need to get as soon as possible for we can put that together. The other issue I'd like just to bring up is Google. I'm hearing a lot about that, being from California, assisting China but not wanting to assist the United States military, which I find troubling, and I suspect that you find troubling also. But to have a U.S. corporation that would in effect contribute to the erosion of U.S. military superiority is troubling. And I would hope that the military would have a memory of that. So that's just the point I want to bring up, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Calvert's an example of what I wish would go on in all committees in Congress, and of course, it also refers to our former chair of this subcommittee as someone to keep me in line, correct me when I'm wrong, and draw my attention to detail. I would point out, however, Mr. Calvert asked that we be as transparent as possible this year.
Yeah, that's
in
true.
conduct of our,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to explore North Korea a little bit. In early March, it was first reported that the military would end major U.S., South Korea joint exercises, joint military exercises. I was curious who made the decision to end these exercises, and what is the military doing instead to maintain readiness against an adversary that remains one of our most dangerous threats?
Congressman, I'm glad you asked the question. For clarity, we didn't end exercises. We rescoped the exercises. And the one thing I'll start by saying is that I am absolutely confident that we have mission-essential tasks for our U.S. forces and in our combined forces, and that the exercise construct that we have in place right now will allow them to continue to do what they say they need to do, and that is to fight tonight. I'm confident of that. What exercises have traditionally been on the peninsula really were twofold. One was for deterrence, and so we advertised them quite a bit, and they were large, and they were visible, and they were designed to send a message. And then, of course, inside of those exercises was also the need to develop combat readiness. We have not compromised on the latter. We have adjusted on the former as we have supported the diplomatic effort against North Korea. So we have worked very closely. The Secretary has provided oversight with General Abrams, Admiral Davis in the Pacific, and our Korean counterparts, which we speak to routinely, to make sure that the exercises that we have in place right now will allow us to get after that readiness issue that I spoke about, even as the profile of the exercises meets the diplomatic environment and contributes to the path that the President and Secretary are on.
Thank you. I'm pleased to hear that. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just have an observation and a brief question. Congress doesn't enjoy a great deal of admiration from the public, and I think one of the reasons has to do with issues like we discussed today, the JEDI situation and the medical records lack of success. An observation, there was a complete lack of urgency from the panel that appeared before us. Instead, there was really an amazing complacency. I think we all walked away very angry, not just disappointed, but very angry with that panel that appeared before us for the medical records. I would suggest to you, Mr. Secretary, that it's going to be very difficult to do what we're asking you to do with the persons who appeared on that panel. There was no urgency whatsoever. Next to you is Mr. Norquist. I don't know if you know this, Mr. Norquist, but I quote you very often because when I chaired Defense, we had a problem, and we made the problem. We put together a great bill, great funding, very specific. Secretary Mattis worked very carefully, closely with us to say what we need. When it was over, we gave that secretary 5 months to spend the money that we just passed. I went to Mr. Norquist and said, this is our fault, we did it. Is there an answer to this? And he gave an answer. He says, yes, there's some things you can do with flexibility. And we need to look for answers and ways to be, particularly with something as urgent as our defense. We need to do the very best job. We need to have an urgency and a understanding of how important this really is. Mr. Norquist, I know that we talked about, because we gave that little bit of time, you can either make mistakes or you can lose the money. We're still getting money that's returned to the Treasury. Can you tell us where that comes from? And what are the three major problems that cause that?
Sure. So there's a couple of things. When Congress appropriate funds, in order to maintain the power of the purse, there are certain controls around them that generally extend to how long we're able to put that money under contract. So operation and maintenance funding is available for a year. Usually at the end of the year, most organizations have obligated 99.5%. We don't want necessarily to get to 100%. We want people to recognize there are certain things where you're better off not putting the money on a contract if it's not valuable enough. Once they've put it on contract, then you can either have the service comes in at less than you thought, or you could have other items that you decide to cancel the service because you're unhappy with the contract performance. Those funds are deobligated. So that's when you see reports that say the department didn't use a certain amount of money. It stayed in the Treasury because at the end of the day, the department generally did something right in terms of didn't spend it, held a contractor accountable. There are certain places in the budget where we have issues that come up. For example, general accounting office has ruled that when we do PCS moves, the time we obligate the money isn't when the PCS occurs or the contract is signed, it's when we notify the family. So now you're 6 months away from having any idea of what the actual bill is. Those types of things create places where the uncertainty level is much higher. And so one of the things we look for is working with the committee as well as with internal controls, how do we get better controls around those use of the funds to be able to be better in predicting. So those are the types of the things we look at. We work with the committee in terms of ways of adjusting that, but it's both, I don't want to say it's just the committee. Internally to the department, there are things we do to try and track the predictions around how much funding is required for an item, so we leave as much, we use it for the highest priority items and ensure it gets properly executed.
Thank you. On the billions that we've spent in the last, what we just determined, 17 years, 17 years on this program, we can't get that back, and it doesn't go to the Treasury, it's just gone.
Mm-hmm.
Let's stop that, and Mr. Norquist could be a great help. Thank you.
In a way, I'd like to follow up with Ms. Granger's line of questioning, and that is the issue of unspent funds, and particularly Mr. Norquist. In 2018, the department undertook a root cause analysis and essentially determined that there were about $17 billion, almost approximating the state of Indiana's budget, of expired or canceled funds at the end of fiscal year 2017. My understanding is that to be a cumulative figure. In the budget submission, there's several requests for additional flexibility on behalf of the department. One is a provision that would extend the use of funds to cover contingent liabilities on 3 programs that are brought forward. Could you walk me through that $17 billion? In a sense, you talked to Ms. Granger about that and somewhat addressed that. You also mentioned in your answer better controls, which I'm more interested in, to be very frank with you, than more flexibility right now. Could you address that?
Certainly. So let me explain the $17 billion. So we take the life of the money, 1 year for O&M and so forth, and then there's 5 years after which the contract has been awarded, but till it's paid out. So when you get to the end of all of that, the question is how much of the money did you receive was actually paid out from the Treasury to a soldier in salary or to a vendor for a service? The answer is about 98%. So you, at the end of a year, you may have obligated 99.5, but by 5 or 6 years later, when you got to final payments, you're at 98%. Now, with the Defense Department's size, 2% is about $17 billion. That is a missed opportunity, but it's not in of itself a bad thing. Many of those reasons those money aren't being spent is when somebody stopped the contract, you got delivery from less, people did a good job on negotiations. So I don't want to imply, you know, taxpayer money not being spent is not a problem, right? That is often a good and virtuous thing. What we did in the analysis
It's always a virtuous thing.
What?
That's always
a virtuous thing. The issue that we looked at is why, right? Is there reasons that we are putting money on things that don't end up paying out, that are not related to holding a contractor accountable? One of the ones you talked about were those 3 contracts. And what happens is, when we put money under contract, we have to set aside funds for contingent liability. What if the contract is terminated? This is part of our full funding requirement. Should the program end, do we have the money to close it? That money is only, again, available for the 5 years. So if the program lasts long enough, when we go to close the contract, the money that was set aside to close that contract is no longer available for the very purpose we originally set it up for. So some of these programs are getting to that point. And the question is, how do we avoid needing to use current year money to pay a bill for which we did in fact set aside the right amount of money in the past, but it's reaching the end of its life? There are other ways of dealing with contingent liability. I'd be happy to talk to the committee about those, but the idea is you don't want to have to pay, and when I say pay twice, the money doesn't actually have to do it, it just stays in the Treasury, but the Congress gave us money for that, and then we had to later come back and either reprogram or ask again for the very same thing again because we've exceeded that 5-year period. You asked about what we look at internally. So one of the side effects of the work we've been doing on the audit and others is to be able to produce extensive data on transaction level activity. And we would find places where people were concerned that money was being ordered, put on contract, and then deobligated later. Well, now we can run analysis that determines where exactly were those. And if they occurred very short periods across from each other, right, one occurred right before the end of the fiscal year and soon thereafter, then you get to dive in and look at why that's happening. The Army found, for example, that in some cases, units that had deployed canceled the orders for the supplies that they needed, and then a unit came in, and the next unit who needed to fall in on that equipment then replaced the order. For the units, that didn't seem to be an issue, but for the department, we had crossed fiscal years. So the contracts that had been placed were then canceled, those funds deobligated, and new funds had to be used. Now, in that case, you can often fix it with a process change up front, but what we're trying to do in general is make sure that when Congress gives us money for a purpose, we soundly use it for that purpose. We don't leave it to be unobligated. The Congress didn't give us extra money with the idea we're not going to use it. They gave us money with the expectation that we would use it for readiness. And building these controls and working with the committee on areas where there's a legislative potential fix is very important. And I go, some of these create secondary effects, and we want to make sure we work through those with the committee so that they are solutions, not a new round of challenges.
I appreciate it and do want to work through this with you because, as you point out, it could be the payment of a new person who was enlisted in the military or did not, and you have not expended those monies, or a very sophisticated contract. Also, do appreciate it is not wrong, in fact, a virtue if you have set aside monies to make sure you can meet that contract, and you come in under that and have saved people's money, that is not bad.
Right.
I would tell you that the question in my mind is relative to the national debt. I'm not going to have a conversation about that today, but if we borrow money, I make one set of decisions if I spend $1. I make another decision if I spend $1.10. I have a different time frame. On this annualized basis, as far as prioritization of programs, if in the recesses of somebody's mind, they know we can take monies from the past and, if you would, enhance the budget we've asked for, those prospective requests could potentially be different than they would if we know there's a fixed amount of money and we can't go back in the past and recapture those funds, if you follow my...
So what I think, if I understand you, Mr. Chairman, is there is a risk, if one does this incorrectly, that somebody will bet on being able to receive the past money and therefore not act for the correct amount. That's the problem. That's what you do not...
Or assume we have...
Or assume they have it, right? So what we would be looking for is solutions where funds were made available for the service that was provided. So you think about, you open up ships to do maintenance and repair on the ships. Some of those ships have fewer problems inside than you thought, and therefore the cost of doing maintenance is much lower. Others, the costs are higher. You would not want to, you would want to be able to rationalize across that. What you didn't want to do is set up an incentive where people intentionally underestimated the requirement under the theory that they were going to get covered for some well. So I understand the point you're bringing is there's some risk of secondary effects, and I think we always have to be attentive into the budget rules to creating the right set of incentives, that people use money wisely and don't either feel the need to hit a high obligation rate or feel the belief that somebody will always come and rescue them if they don't have enough. And that's
I
a
understand you
tight
have
challenge.
those two requests and would not express an opinion on them one way or the other, but do, again, harken back to your conversation with Ms. Granger where you talked about controls. I think that's the place to start. Since you mentioned shipbuilding, I would simply conclude by understanding, I understand there is a change in the Truman that would have an immediate impact on 20, in the great scheme of the budget, not significant, but $17 million, and in the out years, obviously, that's a new item and would enter into discussions with you relative to that. Mr. Calvert? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Diaz-Balart, I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I realize that it's getting late, and so I will be brief. Just two questions. First, about Venezuela. You know, the reality of the Maduro's dictatorship is that you have, Cuban intel and military folks there. You've got Russian presence. You've got Chinese presence. You've got Iranian presence. You've got terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and the like. I've been saying that, to me, that is a national security threat to the United States. Am I wrong?
I think what you said is exactly consistent with what the president has said, Congressman.
By the way, I would also say that that's, in essence, the same situation as Cuba, but speaking about Venezuela, I just wanted to get that for the record, because I think this is a potential serious national security threat right here in this hemisphere. And second question is, going back to the F-35 and the issue about Turkey. Do the Turks understand that if, in fact, they go ahead, and I fear that they probably will, but go ahead with these Russian missiles, that it is impossible for them to receive the F-35? Has that message been sent clear enough, or are they still? Is there any possibility that they haven't understood the message?
I think there's very little possibility that they have a misunderstanding.
And there is, I don't have that misunderstanding, right? And it's one or the other. They cannot have the F-35 in the same.
There's no confusion on our part.
All right. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
We're adjourned. Thanks.